The house glowed with the golden shimmer of Christmas lights, garlands draped across the mantel, the smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon filling the air. For one fragile second, I believed maybe this year would be different, that my family might see me not as broken, but as their daughter who came home alive. I had fought through the deserts of Afghanistan, carried shrapnel in my ribs, and clutched my Purple Heart as proof that survival had meaning. Tonight, I thought perhaps survival would finally be enough. The laughter around the table swelled. Wine glasses clinked. Children whispered snow pressed against the windows. My father sat at the head of the table like a king on his throne. Richard Monroe, his voice always heavier than the carols or the prayers. He fixed his cold eyes on me, tapped his fork against the china, and the room fell into a hush that felt rehearsed. He raised his glass, his mouth curling into a cruel smile. To my daughter, the soldier who should have died in war. His voice cut through the air like shrapnel, deliberate, venomous, amplified by the silence that followed. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I thought I misheard, but the smirk on my brother's face confirmed it. Michael leaned back in his chair, fingering the expensive watch Richard had bought him, and let out a short laugh that twisted like a knife. The guests froze. My cousins dropped their eyes to their plates. Even Joanna, my so-called mother, kept her gaze pinned to her folded hands as though she hadn't heard a thing. No one spoke. No one defended me. Richard tilted his glass higher as though it were a toast, his eyes never leaving mine, sipping his wine with the calm satisfaction of a man delivering a verdict. Heat flooded my chest, then turned to ice as humiliation crawled under my scarred skin. My Purple Heart gleamed under the light, a symbol of sacrifice, yet in my father's words, it was meaningless, something to mock. The record playing soft jazz crackled and skipped, the music faltering like it too had recoiled from the cruelty. My body went rigid. I searched for air, but found only silence, a suffocating silence that screamed louder than gunfire. I had faced bullets, explosions, comrades bleeding out in my arms, but nothing prepared me for the sight of my family watching in silence while my father raised his glass to my death. The duffel bag by the door, the one that had carried my life through deserts and airstrikes, suddenly felt like a coffin waiting to be claimed. Richard's eyes were locked on mine, steady, unblinking, like a sniper who had already fired. He smirked as he placed his glass down the crystal, kissing the wood with finality. My survival was not a blessing here. It was an inconvenience. I was not a hero. I was a burden. And in that moment, under the glow of Christmas lights surrounded by the family I had bled to protect, I realized something colder than the snow outside. To them, I was already dead. The cold hit me the moment I stepped outside, sharper than any blade, cutting through the wool of my coat and biting into the scar tissue beneath my ribs. Snow drifted down in fat, lazy flakes, but to me it felt like ash, like the remnants of a life burned away. Behind me, the glow of the house pulsed warm and golden laughter, faintly resuming after my father's venomous toast, as though my humiliation had been nothing more than a hiccup in their holiday cheer. My boots crunched against the ice as I walked down the front steps, each step heavier, each breath a struggle against the lump in my throat. I told myself not to cry. Soldiers do not cry in front of their enemies, and tonight, my enemies were the people who shared my blood. I reached the street lamp at the end of the driveway, its light flickering like it too was unsure whether to stay alive, and leaned against the metal post, gripping it as if it could anchor me. My chest rose and fell fast and shallow, my lungs still learning to breathe through scar tissue, and in that rhythm, memories surged back, unbidden, unrelenting. I saw myself at 12, standing in the same dining room, Michael's fist crashing into my jaw because I had dared to win a board game against him. I remembered the snap of bone in my wrist as he shoved me against the table, and Joanna rushing in not to comfort me, not to scold him, but to hiss in my ear, "Do not ruin Christmas with your whining." I remembered my father's hand, massive and calloused, striking my cheek when I was 17, and told him I wanted to enlist. "No daughter of mine goes to war," he barked, and when I did anyway, he spat at the floor as if I had desecrated his name. Yet even then I wrote letters, sent money, prayed that one day he would see me as worthy. Now years later, I understood the truth. His love had always been conditional, and I had failed the condition the moment I was born a girl. My breath misted in the frigid night as I stumbled further down the road, my duffel bag bouncing against my thigh, the same bag I carried through ambushes and evacuations, the bag that had more loyalty to me than my family ever did. The sound of carols from a passing radio mocked me. Cheerful voices singing about joy, about home, about peace on earth. I wanted to scream. Instead, I walked. Snowflakes gathered on my eyelashes until the world blurred, but it was not the snow that blinded me. It was betrayal, thick and suffocating, wrapping around me like smoke from a battlefield. I reached the bus stop at the corner, a lonely shelter of glass and rusting steel, and collapsed onto the bench. My breath fogged the glass, and in the reflection, I barely recognized myself. Hollow eyes, pale skin, the faint scar across my cheek from the bomb that nearly took my life overseas. Once in uniform, those scars had been medals of honor. Tonight, they were just reminders that my father had wished I had not survived at all. A car passed, slowing for a moment, headlights sweeping across me, then sped away. The driver's face turned quickly the way people look when they see a stray dog too battered to help. My hand tightened around the purple heart still pinned to my chest. It felt heavier now, not because of the metal, but because of the weight of betrayal it could not shield me from. I remembered the night in Kabul when I earned it, the explosion tearing through the convoy flames lighting up the sky, the sound of screaming in my ears. I remembered dragging a wounded comrade behind a wall, pressing my body against his to shield him while blood poured from my own side. I had told myself, "Hold on, you are going home. You have a family waiting." That promise had carried me through pain, through rehab, through sleepless nights haunted by ghosts of war. But here I was, sitting on a frozen bench, realizing that the family I thought I had waited for me only so they could spit me out like spoiled wine. My hands trembled. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass tears slipping down, despite my orders to myself not to cry. Each tear froze on my skin, almost instantly, tiny daggers carving lines down my cheeks. The street lamp above flickered, buzzed, and steadied again. In that harsh light, I saw my reflection clearly for the first time, and what I saw hollowed me. I was not Captain Monroe, the soldier, the protector. I was Sarah, the unwanted daughter, the burden. The bus groaned up to the curb, brakes squealing, doors opening with a hiss. The driver, an older man with kind eyes, glanced at me but said nothing, only gave a small nod as if he knew words would cut deeper than silence. I climbed aboard, the stale heat wrapping around me like a thin blanket, and sank into a seat near the back. A handful of passengers sat scattered, each wrapped in their own silence, eyes glazed with exhaustion or sorrow. Perhaps they too were refugees of families that no longer wanted them. The bus rumbled forward, pulling me away from the glow of the house that had never been a home, away from the man who had declared me dead in all but breath. Outside, snow blurred the world into streaks of white and gray, and with each mile I felt the weight of illusion fall away. Family had been my last illusion, and tonight it shattered. My pulse steadied slow and deliberate like the rhythm of a march. Pain had carved me open, but inside that wound something stirred, something sharp and alive. Rage. Not the kind that burns fast and dies, but the kind that simmers patient waiting. I pressed my palm against the Purple Heart once more, not for comfort, but as a vow. They wanted me dead. They wanted me erased. But I was still here. And one day they would know exactly what it meant to leave a soldier with nothing left to lose. The bus rattled through the night, its heater groaning against the cold as the windows fogged with the weary breaths of strangers. I sat in the back, clutching my duffel bag, my pulse slowly easing into the steady rhythm of resignation. Outside, the suburbs gave way to dark fields blanketed in snow, the world shrinking into shades of gray and white. Each mile carried me further from the house that had rejected me, closer to the one place that had ever felt like refuge. My grandmother Estelle's farm lay at the edge of town, tucked behind rows of pine trees that bent under the weight of ice. I had not seen her in years, not since before my first deployment, but I could still remember her hands braiding my hair, the smell of fresh pies cooling on the windowsill, and her voice telling me always to come back no matter what. The bus hissed to a stop at a small wooden sign half buried in snow. The driver gave me a quiet nod as I stepped off into the silence of midnight. The cold wrapped around me instantly, a sharp reminder that life does not pause for wounds. My boots crunched against frozen gravel as I began the half-mile walk toward the farmhouse. Each step stirred memories, summers chasing fireflies, autumn afternoons stacking hay nights, staring at the stars from the swing that still hung from the old oak. By the time the farmhouse came into view, glowing softly against the darkness, my throat had tightened with a mixture of dread and fragile hope. Smoke rose from the chimney, the faint scent of burning cedar drifting through the air. Light spilled from the kitchen window, warm and steady like a beacon calling me home. I froze at the gate, suddenly afraid. Afraid she would not remember me. Afraid she would not want me. Afraid even Estelle had turned her back. My hand trembled on the latch, but before I could move, the door creaked open. And there she was, Estelle Monroe. Her hair silver and loose around her shoulders, a thick cardigan draped over her frame, feet bare against the wooden floor. Her eyes sharp and unwavering, locked onto mine in an instant. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. Then her voice carried across the frozen yard, calm and cutting through the night. "They finally broke you." The words pierced me not with cruelty, but with recognition, the unbearable weight of being seen. My knees buckled, not from exhaustion, but from the flood of shame and relief crashing together. Tears spilled hot and fast down my frozen cheeks. Estelle crossed the porch in 2 steps, pulled me into her arms, and held me so tightly I could feel the tremor of her bones. I sobbed into her shoulder, my breath hitching, my body shaking, the pain pouring out in gasps I had never allowed myself to release. She did not shush me, did not tell me to stop. She just held on as though she had been waiting for this moment all along. When the storm of tears finally slowed, she pulled back enough to look me in the eyes. "You are not broken, Sarah," she said. "You are wounded." "Yes, but wounds can heal. Broken things cannot fight back. And I know you. You will fight." Her words sank into me deeper than any medal or title ever had. She led me inside without another word. The warmth of the house hit me like a wave, the scent of cedar and honey wrapping around me, the soft hum of an old heater rattling in the corner. She draped one of her heavy quilts over my shoulders, its weight grounding me. "Sit," she said simply, handing me a steaming mug of spiced tea. "Tomorrow there will be time for talking. Tonight, just be." And for the first time in years, I believed I could. I slept that night under her quilt, the faint cluck of chickens outside, and the creak of the farmhouse settling into the snow. When morning came, sunlight filtered through lace curtains, turning the room golden. My body ached familiar pains from old injuries, but beneath it stirred something I had not felt in years, a quiet steadiness. I dressed in one of Estelle's oversized flannel shirts, pulled on wool socks, and padded into the kitchen. She was at the stove, flipping eggs into a cast-iron pan, her movements steady, her back straight. She did not turn to look at me, only gestured to the percolator. "Coffee is fresh." I poured a cup, sat at the table, and for a long while there was only the sound of sizzling butter and the smell of breakfast. No questions, no small talk, just peace. After we ate, Estelle set her fork down, folded her hands, and looked me square in the eye. "There is something upstairs you need to see." My heart thudded as she led me up the narrow staircase that groaned under each step. At the end of the hallway, she opened a door I had not entered since childhood. My old bedroom. Dust coated the surface as boxes lined the walls, but the wallpaper remained soft blue daisies I had picked when I was 7. On a shelf sat tattered paperbacks I had once loved, their spines broken from overuse. But what caught my eye was the nightstand. The drawer was ajar, something peeking out. I opened it and pulled free a faded leather sketchbook. My sketchbook. I thought it had been lost years ago. I turned the pages slowly. Soldiers Mountain's A Girl with Sad Eyes, who I now realized had been me. At the very back was an envelope yellowed with age, sealed and addressed in sharp cursive. For Sarah. To be opened when everything falls apart. My breath caught. My hands trembled. I could not open it. Not yet. Not while my chest still ached from the sting of my father's voice. Instead, I slipped the letter into my duffel bag and turned to Estelle, who stood in the doorway, her expression steady. "You kept all this," I whispered. She nodded. "This house remembers you even if they choose not to." I sank onto the bed, the quilt sagging under my weight, and for the first time in a long while I felt the faint echo of belonging. The afternoon light dimmed into a pale gray as snow tapped against the windows, and Estelle guided me into the parlor, her steps slow but steady, her eyes sharp with something unsaid. She placed a wooden box on the table, its surface worn smooth by decades of use, and pushed it toward me. Inside lay bundles of letters, journals bound in leather, and a handful of documents that looked older than I was. "These are your mother's," she said softly. "Not Joanna. Meredith." My breath caught. Meredith. The name felt like a secret I had known all my life but never spoken aloud. I opened the first journal, the pages, fragile ink faded but legible. The entries began with warmth notes about her pregnancy, her joy at feeling me kick for the first time, her hope that she could raise me safe. But as the pages turned, the tone darkened. Meredith wrote about Richard. She described his temper, his obsession with control, his disdain for weakness. She wrote about how he began showing up at her apartment uninvited, how he shouted that she was shaming the family by keeping me. Then one entry dated only weeks before her death made my stomach knot. "He told me tonight that if I do not fall in line, he will erase me. I do not know what that means, but I am afraid." I traced the words with trembling fingers, the paper soft and thin under my skin. Estelle placed another document before me, a death certificate. Meredith Monroe. Cause of death, apartment fire, faulty wiring. But Estelle shook her head. "That is what they wanted you to believe." She pulled another folder, this one stamped with the name of an insurance company. Inside, I found a claim for $250,000 filed and approved within days of Meredith's death. Beneficiary, Richard Monroe. My pulse thundered in my ears. He profited from her death. Estelle's eyes brimmed with unshed tears. He told everyone he was a hero for stepping in to raise his niece, but I always suspected it was blood money. I felt nausea rise as I shuffled through more papers, receipts, property transfers, all tying back to Richard. Then I uncovered a small cassette tape wrapped in tissue. Estelle's hands trembled as she placed a tape recorder on the table. I pressed play. Static filled the air, then a man's voice, harsh, unmistakable. "If you don't shut up, Meredith, I'll make sure no one remembers you." My father's voice. My stomach lurched, my hands shaking so hard the tape nearly slipped. The sound of Meredith's faint voice followed trembling, begging him to leave her alone. Then silence. I slammed the stop button, heart hammering. Estelle's face was pale, her jaw tight. "I kept that hidden for years," she whispered. "I was afraid if he knew I had it, he would destroy me too." I stared at the journal, the tape, the insurance claim, the mountain of evidence that screamed one truth. My mother's death had not been an accident. My father had buried her. And all these years, Joanna had played along, pretending to be my mother, reaping the benefits of Richard's lies, while I grew up believing her coldness was just maternal disappointment. Rage roared in my chest, hot and suffocating, so strong I thought it would split me open. I rose to my feet, pacing the room, the quilt dragging from my shoulders. Why did no one tell me I demanded? Estelle looked away, shame etching lines deeper into her face. He threatened me. He said if I ever told you, I would never see you again. I thought staying close was the only way to protect you. It was cowardice, Sarah, and I regret it every day. I slammed my hand against the wall, the sound rattling the picture frames. All these years, I sent them money, I bled for their approval, and it was all a lie. My medals, my service, my life. All for a man who killed my real mother. Estelle stood steady despite the tremor in her hands. Meredith loved you more than anything. She wanted you to survive. She tried to leave a trail in case something happened, and now, finally, you see it. My knees gave out and I sank into the chair, clutching my head. The images swirled my father's smirk at dinner, my brother's mocking laughter, Joanna's silence, and now Meredith's voice, whispering from the grave. Everything I had believed about family fractured into shards that cut me deeper than war ever had. Estelle placed a hand on my shoulder. There is more. She led me upstairs into the attic, the wooden steps groaning under our weight. She pulled aside a faded quilt to reveal a trunk. Inside were more journals, newspaper clippings, old fire reports, and a file stamped with Meredith Monroe's medical history. I sifted through them, my fingers numb. One document caught my eye, a hand-drawn diagram of Meredith's apartment with markings near the fuse box. Scribbled beside it in shaky handwriting were the words, "Not an accident." My breath came in gasps as I pieced it together. Someone had known. Maybe Meredith herself, maybe a friend who tried to warn her. Either way, it was proof. Proof that my father's story had never been the truth. At the bottom of the trunk, I found another journal, initials MM engraved on the cover. I opened it to the first page. April 17th. Sarah said the word mama today. I cried for an hour. She is mine, all mine. Even Joanna cannot take that from me. My chest ached as I flipped through the entries. Pages of love, of devotion, of fear. She wrote about my laughter, my drawings, my stubbornness, her worry that Richard would never let her be free. Then the entries turned darker. October 9th. I heard someone outside last night. Sarah was asleep. I did not turn on the lights. Something is wrong. If anything happens to me, promise me someone will tell her I loved her more than anything. Promise me someone will tell her Joanna. The rest of the page had been scratched out violently, ink smeared into black scars. I stared until my vision blurred. Meredith had known. She had left her fear on the page in case she did not survive. The journal ended abruptly, days later. No farewell. No closing thoughts. Just silence. I closed the book carefully, holding it to my chest, as though I could draw her into me, as though I could finally feel the mother I had been denied. Estelle's voice trembled. She was going to run. She told me she had a plan to leave town with you. I begged her to stay. I told her she was safe here. I was wrong. That guilt has lived in my bones ever since. I reached for her hand. You did not fail her. Richard did. And now it is time he pays. Estelle nodded slowly, her eyes hardening with resolve. My pulse steadied. For the first time since stepping into this farmhouse, I felt not only grief, but purpose. Meredith had left her truth behind. Now it was my turn to bring it into the light. The next morning dawned gray and brittle, the kind of cold that seeps into the bones and does not let go. I sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by Meredith's journals, the cassette tape, and the insurance documents, my hands wrapped tightly around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. Estelle sat across from me, her back straight, her eyes unflinching. "You cannot carry this alone." "Sarah," she said, "he is too powerful, too entrenched. If you go at him blindly, he will bury you like he buried her." I nodded slowly, though my jaw clenched with rage. "Then we find someone who cannot be buried. We need the law." Estelle hesitated, then mentioned a name, Daniel Clark, a retired lawyer who had once questioned the fire, but was silenced when Richard's influence shut the case down. "He lives just outside town," she said. "He has nothing to lose now." That afternoon we drove through the snow-dusted countryside, the heater in Estelle's truck barely working our breath, fogging the windshield as we approached a sagging farmhouse. Daniel answered the door with suspicion etched across his lined face, but when Estelle whispered Meredith's name, his eyes softened with recognition and sorrow. We sat in his cluttered office, the walls lined with books and yellowing newspapers. I spread the evidence across his desk. He examined each piece carefully, adjusting his glasses, his fingers trembling slightly as he unfolded the insurance claim. "I always knew something was wrong," he muttered. I argued that faulty wiring made no sense, but the report was rushed, the case closed too quickly. "Your father was already rising in politics. He had friends in high places." I played him the cassette tape. Richard's voice filled the room low and threatening, followed by Meredith's faint plea. Daniel's eyes darkened. That tape alone could reopen the case. Combined with the insurance documents and her journals, this is enough to shake his foundation. But you must understand, Sarah, he is not just your father. He is a man with influence, with allies. If you go after him, you will make enemies. I leaned forward, meeting his gaze with steady resolve. I have faced enemies before. I am not afraid of his friends. Daniel studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. There may be someone else. He said someone who was there the night of the fire. A retired firefighter named Tom Bradley. He whispered once that the blaze was not accidental, but when I pressed him, he shut down. He was threatened, I think. If you can convince him to speak, his testimony would seal this. We found Tom in a small house on the outskirts of town, a man whose once broad shoulders now sagged under the weight of years and regret. He opened the door reluctantly, his eyes darting with suspicion. But when I introduced myself as Meredith's daughter, something in his gaze shifted. He invited us in his living room cluttered with old photographs and half-empty bottles. He sat heavily in a chair, his voice hoarse. I should have spoken years ago, he admitted. That night, I knew the fire was not an accident. The pattern of the burn, the way the flames started near the fuse box but spread too quickly. I wrote it down in my report, but my captain told me to change it. He said the order came from above. He looked at me with weary eyes. I wanted to tell the truth, but I had a family, children. Richard had power and I was scared. My hands tightened into fists. And now my mother is dead, buried, as if she were careless, erased, as if she meant nothing. Tom's voice cracked. I am sorry, but if you bring this to light, if you fight him, I will stand beside you. I am old, Sarah, but I am not too old to finally do the right thing. Estelle reached for his hand, gratitude softening her features. Back in the truck, my mind raced. We had evidence. We had a witness. We had a lawyer willing to reopen the wound. For the first time, victory felt within reach. But my anger burned hotter knowing Richard still stood at podiums preaching about family values, while the truth lay rotting in dusty boxes. At dinner that evening, Estelle asked the question that had hovered unspoken. How will you do it? The police will take months, maybe years to act. He will bury it all again if you give him time. I set down my fork with deliberate calm. We strike in public where he cannot silence us. There is one place he cannot control the spotlight. Estelle frowned. You mean the gala? Richard's annual Christmas charity gala was the crown jewel of his public life, broadcast in local papers, attended by donors and politicians, his chance to parade his image of generosity and perfect family. It was scheduled in less than 2 weeks. Yes, I said. We go to the gala. We bring everything. The journals, the tape, the insurance files, Tom's testimony. We confront him in front of the people whose approval he craves. Estelle's eyes widened, fear and admiration mingling. That will destroy him. If it fails, it will destroy you too. My voice was steady, my heart pounding. I have already been destroyed. It is time he knows what that feels like. Daniel agreed to prepare copies of every document, ensuring nothing could be erased. Tom swore he would attend his voice, finally ready to break 2 decades of silence. Estelle promised to stand beside me, her spine straight as iron. And me, I felt a storm building in my chest, not the chaos of despair, but the clarity of resolve. The soldier in me recognized the pattern. We had intelligence, we had allies, we had a plan. The mission was not survival, it was justice. That night, lying beneath Estelle's quilt, I stared at the ceiling and whispered to the darkness. You tried to erase her, Richard. You tried to erase me, but you failed. And on that stage in front of everyone, you deceived the world will finally see you for what you are. The night of the gala arrived, wrapped in glittering snow, the city dressed in lights that shimmered against the frozen sidewalks. I stood before the Grand Hotel's entrance in full uniform, the navy jacket pressed and gleaming, my purple heart pinned proudly against my chest. Estelle stood beside me in a burgundy gown, her silver hair swept neatly, her pearls glowing faintly under the spotlights. Daniel Clark was at her other side, carrying a leather folder heavy with copies of evidence, his face carved with determination. Behind us, Tom Bradley shifted nervously in a dark suit, his shoulders hunched, but his eyes steady. Cameras flashed as we approached the entrance, photographers recognizing the estranged daughter of Richard Monroe. Whispers rippled through the crowd. What is she doing here? Is that her grandmother? Why the uniform? The ballroom doors opened, and we stepped into a sea of chandeliers, polished marble, and perfumed air. Tables sparkled with crystal, the hum of conversation filling the cavernous room until Richard's voice rose above it all. He stood near the stage, tall, proud, the perfect politician in a tailored suit, Joanna glittering at his side. Michael close behind in another expensive watch. Richard smiled, teeth flashing like ivory blades. Family, he declared into the microphone, is the foundation of society. Without it, we are nothing. Applause rippled through the room, donors clinking glasses, journalists scribbling notes. My fists clenched as bile rose in my throat. The man who had murdered my mother was preaching about family values. I felt Estelle squeeze my arm. Now she whispered. I stepped forward, my boots clicking against the marble, my heart pounding so loud it drowned out the orchestra. The crowd hushed as I reached the stage cameras, turning whispers swelling into gasps. Richard's eyes widened for a split second, then narrowed into cold calculation. "Sarah," he said smoothly as though greeting a guest. How unexpected. His smile stretched tight, but his jaw twitched. Joanna froze at his side, her hand trembling on her clutch. Michael smirked, whispering something to a friend that drew a stifled laugh. I climbed onto the stage, the lights blinding, the weight of hundreds of eyes pressing down. I reached for the medal pinned to my chest, lifted it high, and my voice rang out. "You told me I should have died in war." The words cracked the silence, slicing through the air like gunfire. Gasps spread a murmur of shock rolling across the room. My father's smile faltered, his hand tightening on the podium. "But the truth is worse. You killed my real mother for money." The room erupted in whispers, chairs scraping the press, raising cameras like rifles. Richard's face drained of color, his composure cracking as Daniel stepped forward, holding the folder aloft. "We have the journals, the insurance claims, the recordings." Daniel's voice boomed. "And we are no longer afraid." Richard barked a laugh, brittle and hollow. "This is nonsense. Lies spun by a bitter child." But before he could continue, Tom Bradley stepped onto the stage. "I was there," he said, his voice rough but strong. "That fire was no accident. I saw the burn patterns. I wrote the truth. I was silenced. Now I will not be silent again." Gasps turned to shouts. Shame. Murderer. People rose from their seats, some backing away, as though Richard carried contagion. Others leaned forward, phones raised, recording every second. One woman near the front began live streaming, her voice trembling as she narrated. The congressman's daughter just accused him of killing his wife. The hashtag ignited in real time. Within minutes, #justice for. Meredith trended across platforms, comments flooding in, the scandal unfurling like wildfire. Richard's mask crumbled, his face contorting with fury. "You think anyone will believe you?" he hissed, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You are a disgrace, Sarah, nothing more." My pulse steadied, the soldier in me rising. "They will not have to believe me. They will hear you themselves." I held up the cassette player, pressed play, and Richard's own voice poured through the speakers. "If you don't shut up, Meredith, I'll make sure no one remembers you." The ballroom froze. The silence was electric, suffocating. Joanna gasped, clutching her pearls, her face pale as she stumbled back a step. Michael cursed under his breath, his smirk vanishing. Richard lunged forward, trying to snatch the player, but Estelle stepped between us, her spine straight as iron, her voice sharp enough to carry across the hall. "Enough lies, Richard. The world knows now." Shouts rose again, journalists scrambling, flashes exploding. Some guests stood in pointed voices, rising in condemnation. "Murderer. Liar." His donors shifted uneasily, some slipping out the doors, others pulling out their phones to text frantically. The illusion of control shattered. Richard's empire was collapsing before my eyes, and I had lit the match. He spun to Joanna, whispering furiously, "Do something!" Joanna shook her head, her lips pressed thin, her eyes darting to the cameras. For once, she had no script. She turned and fled, the stage heels clattering against the marble, the crowd parting to let her through. Michael, red-faced, shouted across the room, "You ruined us, Sarah! You selfish little—" His voice broke as the cameras swiveled toward him, recording every syllable. A reporter shouted back, "Your sister just showed proof your father killed her mother, and you call her selfish." The audience booed. Michael's face twisted, but he faltered, retreating under the weight of their scorn. Richard staggered, sweat beading on his forehead, rage flashing in his eyes. He raised his hands as though commanding silence, but no one obeyed. Voices shouted over him, the sound of truth rising higher than any lie. Estelle placed her hand in mine, her grip steady. "It is over," she said. I looked into Richard's eyes, the man who had wished me dead, who had tried to erase Meredith, who had built his life on the bones of lies. My voice was calm, steady, final. "You cannot bury us anymore. We will not be silent." Cameras flashed. Live streams surged. The world was watching. And Richard Monroe, the man who once held power over every room he entered, stood cornered, exposed, and utterly alone. By the time the gala ended, the story had already outrun the chandeliers and champagne. Guests rushed into the cold night whispering furiously, phones pressed to ears, faces pale with disbelief. Some had slipped away early, unable to stomach the confrontation, but others stayed only long enough to capture every second on video. Before midnight, clips of Richard's face drained of color as his own voice threatened. Meredith spread like wildfire. On social media, the hashtag #JusticeForMeredith burned at the top of trending lists shared by strangers across the country, who knew nothing of us yet felt the weight of betrayal. By dawn, national outlets replayed the footage. Anchors spoke in careful tones about the respected congressman now accused by his daughter of murder and fraud. Talk show hosts debated the implications while commentators dissected the recordings frame by frame. In less than 12 hours, Richard Monroe's carefully built image of virtue had collapsed. The phone at Estelle's farmhouse rang without pause, reporters begging for statements, neighbors leaving messages of support or outrage. I ignored them all. I sat at the kitchen table, the Purple Heart still pinned to my chest, watching the world wake up to the truth. Richard himself stayed silent. His official office released a thin statement calling the accusations malicious lies from a troubled veteran, but it only fueled the flames. Commentators replayed the audio again and again. "If you don't shut up, Meredith, I'll make sure no one remembers you." His voice condemned him more than I ever could. Joanna tried to stand by him in the first hours, giving a brief interview outside their mansion, where she declared her husband a good man, a victim of slander. But the footage of her fleeing the ballroom surfaced minutes later, her face twisted in panic, her hands trembling. The hypocrisy destroyed her defense. Overnight, she became a target of ridicule. Within days, she filed for divorce, desperate to salvage her reputation, but the public had already judged her as complicit, a woman who chose silence for comfort while another woman burned. Michael fared no better. The clip of him shouting, "You ruined us!" Sarah ricocheted across platforms, replayed with captions calling him entitled and heartless. His company released a statement cutting ties with him, condemning his words as disgraceful. He lost his job, his endorsements, even friends who once circled him like flies around honey. He vanished from public sight, but not before sending me a venomous message blaming me for his fall. I read it once, then deleted it, the bitterness of his downfall no longer my concern. The real reckoning came for Richard. Within days, law enforcement announced a reopening of Meredith's case. Detectives requested the original fire report, subpoenaed the insurance company, and scheduled interviews with Tom Bradley. The Attorney General's office confirmed a full investigation into possible arson, fraud, and homicide. Richard's political allies began to distance themselves immediately. Senators who once praised his speeches suddenly released carefully worded condemnations. His own party leadership issued a public statement. "We condemn the actions and words attributed to Congressman Monroe. The people deserve integrity, and we support the investigation." With that single declaration, decades of alliances shattered. He was alone. His face disappeared from campaign posters, his name scrubbed from fundraising events. Donors withdrew pledges. He resigned from his committee positions under pressure, insisting it was temporary, but the truth was plain. Richard Monroe, the man who once commanded every room, was now toxic, a liability. I watched it unfold not with joy, but with grim satisfaction. Justice was not a parade. It was slow, grinding, relentless, and it was finally grinding him down. Reporters camped outside his estate, cameras flashing whenever his car pulled from the driveway. Protesters gathered with signs demanding accountability. Veterans posted messages of solidarity with me, men and women who understood betrayal at the deepest level. Every headline, every broadcast, every trending hashtag was another nail in the coffin of his legacy. Estelle sat with me through it all, her hand steady on mine, her eyes fierce despite the years etched in them. She whispered often, Meredith would be proud. Daniel Clark moved forward with legal filings, ensuring the evidence stayed in the public record. Tom Bradley gave his testimony, his voice trembling at first, then strengthening with each word, as though the truth was burning away years of guilt. The case had momentum, and Richard could no longer hide. One evening, as snow dusted the farmhouse roof, I stood at the window, staring out at the frozen fields. In the distance, I imagined the echo of Richard's voice, once so powerful, now reduced to static. My breath fogged the glass. He had stolen my mother, poisoned my childhood, scarred me with wounds deeper than combat. Yet now, for the first time, he faced a force he could not control: the truth. And the truth was no longer mine alone. It belonged to everyone who had seen that gala, who had shared those videos, who had whispered shame into the night. He was finished. Winter began to loosen its grip, the snow melting into rivulets that traced lines through the fields surrounding Estelle's farmhouse. The world outside thawed slowly, but inside I felt the change moving faster, like cracks in ice spreading into rivers. For weeks, the media storm swirled around us, headlines blaring about Richard's downfall, interviews with experts dissecting every document, every tape, every detail of the gala. Yet within the farmhouse walls, there was something gentler growing. Estelle, Daniel, Tom, and I spent long evenings by the fire, speaking not just of justice, but of healing. It was Daniel who suggested we do something more than expose Richard, something that would outlive his disgrace. "What if we turned this place into a sanctuary?" he said one night, his voice steady. "A center for veterans, for survivors, for people carrying scars like yours." Estelle's eyes softened. Meredith would want that, and so the idea of the shelter line was born. We cleared out the old barn dust and cobwebs, giving way to light streaming through new windows. Volunteers came, some neighbors, some strangers who had seen my story online and felt compelled to help. We scrubbed floors, painted walls, hauled in furniture, donated by those who wanted to stand on the side of truth. By spring, the barn no longer held ghosts, it held hope. Veterans arrived, first men and women carrying wounds visible and invisible. Some came to talk, some to paint, some simply to sit under the oak tree where I had once played as a child. Survivors of abuse joined them, their stories different yet familiar threads of pain, weaving into a fabric of resilience. The purple heart I once clutched in despair found a place on the wall, not as a symbol of my father's scorn, but of survival reclaimed. Estelle, though her body grew slower with age, stood at the entrance each morning with a pot of coffee and a smile that reminded everyone who stepped inside that they were not broken. Daniel handled the legal work, filing papers to register us as a nonprofit, ensuring the land would be protected long after Richard's name faded from memory. Tom brought his firefighter friends, some retired, some still serving men who had seen too many flames and needed a quiet place to cool the embers. Slowly, the farmhouse became more than a refuge for me. It became a refuge for many. I began to write again. Not reports, not military memos, but stories, my story. Meredith's story, the story of what it means to be silenced and what it means to break free. I filled notebooks with words, some angry, some tender, all honest. Estelle often found me at the kitchen table in the early hours, pen racing across the page, tears slipping silently down my cheeks. She would place a hand on my shoulder and whisper, "Let it out, Sarah. Words are weapons too." Summer came bright and golden. Fields swayed with tall grass, bees hummed around the wildflowers, and laughter floated from the barn as veterans painted murals across its walls. One afternoon, while tending the garden, I received a letter with no return address. Inside was a photograph of Joanna sitting alone on a park bench. Her shoulders hunched, her face lined with exhaustion. On the back, a single sentence was scrawled: "Some truths never die." I stared at it for a long while before feeding it to the fire. I did not need her shadow anymore. The past could smolder into ash. What mattered was the life we were building now. Estelle's health waned as summer deepened. She moved more slowly, her breath shorter, but her spirit burned bright. On her 82nd birthday, we gathered in the barn, now filled with art and laughter, and she stood at the center, her spine still proud. "This," she said, sweeping her hand around the room, "is the family I always dreamed we would make." That night, I painted her portrait, her eyes sharp, her smile small but full of quiet triumph. I titled it "The Anchor" and hung it at the barn's entrance so everyone who stepped inside would know who held us steady. Months later, she passed peacefully in her sleep, her hand in mine, her face calm. She left me the farmhouse in her will, along with a note written in her careful script. "Now it is your turn to make the world gentler." I wept over the paper, clutching it as though it could tether me to her one last time. I promised her I would, and I have. Today, the barn is filled with life. Veterans share meals at long wooden tables, survivors plant flowers in the garden, children laugh on the swing beneath the oak tree. The air hums not with secrets or shame, but with the steady rhythm of healing. My purple heart remains on the wall, a reminder of where I came from, but beside it hangs something more important: Meredith's journal displayed under glass, her words preserved for everyone to read. She loved, she feared, she fought, and she mattered. The world may have tried to erase her, but here her voice lives on. Sometimes late at night, I walk to the maple tree Estelle and I planted beside the oak, the stone at its base carved with Meredith's name. I sit under its branches and whisper to her, "I survived. They tried to silence you, to bury me, but we are louder now." And every time I rise, every time I welcome someone new into the shelter line, I carry her with me. I am no longer the soldier unwanted at her family's table, no longer the burden my father spat upon. I am Sarah Monroe, daughter of Meredith, granddaughter of Estelle, survivor, builder, healer. The night sky stretches above vast and unbroken, and I feel whole,